you can start.
Good afternoon, a very warm welcome from Brussels on the last day of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung's conference on the pandemic and global democracy. The last panel today, panel 4, will deal with the issue of how to reclaim democracy, new opportunities for civil society mobilization. My name is Manfred Hornung. I'm currently based in Brussels and in charge of the Unit Global Support for Democracy. Before that, I have worked with the Heinrich-Böll Foundation as the regional director for the Southeast Asia office in Bangkok, and before that as the director of the Cambodia office. Prior to that, I've also worked with the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Southeast Asia, as well as with the Cambodian human rights organization, Likado. Before that, even I have also worked with the UNDP in a project at the People's Supreme Court in Laos that dealt with the education of judges and public prosecutors. Before I will go to the introduction of our 3 panelists, just a few remarks on housekeeping. The panel will be simultaneously translated in 3 languages. You will see there's on the right side, you will see the button interpretation. There you can choose your language. It's French, English, and German. And you'll also see down there the Q&A button. So after 1 hour panel, we will also have 30 minutes for Q&A, and we would be very pleased if you could contribute your questions to the 3 panelists. My colleague, Louisa Reh, will take that part, and she will collate these questions and then later put it to us in the panel. So that's it before I go to introduce our 3 panelists. I'm very pleased to welcome Coumba Touré. Coumba is the movement coordinator for the movement Africans Rising, a movement for peace and justice and dignity based in Dakar, Senegal. And I think Coumba is also joining us at the moment from Senegal, if I'm correct. She's also a writer and a storyteller, and she designs a range of educational materials. And also, not to forget, Coumba is the member of the African Feminist Forum. So a warm welcome to you, Coumba. We're looking very much forward to your participation. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Vicente Paolo Yu. Vicente works as an independent expert and consultant for various United Nations agencies and NGOs. He's also a senior advisor with the Third World Network. And if I'm correct, Vicente, you also had a role in the South Center, an intergovernmental research institution that is supporting developing countries in the different multilateral fora. He also, Vicente has authored several briefings on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on civil society, including the international negotiations by virtual means in the time of COVID-19 pandemic, a report we will refer to, I guess, quite extensively during these discussions this afternoon. Also, warm welcome to you, Vicente. And last but not least, I'd also like to welcome Richard Youngs. Richard is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at Carnegie Europe. He works extensively on EU foreign policy and on issues of international democracy. Richard has authored 15 books so far. Among his most recent works are Rebuilding European Democracy, Resistance and Renewal in Illiberal Age, and the European Union and Global Politics. He's also, and that is the document we will also refer to a fair bit this afternoon, he's also the principal author of the paper Civil Society and the Global Pandemic, Building Back Different. So also a warm welcome to you, Richard. And that actually brings me to the first question, and I'd like to address you and give the floor to you, Coumba, about your experience. As I said, you're a movement coordinator for Africans Rising, and I just wanted to ask you maybe to give us a little outlook on what you've been doing during the pandemic, what Africans Rising is standing for, the philosophy, vision and mission of African Risings, and then in particular how you adapted and innovated your ways of mobilization and collaboration in the civil society world of the Pan-African movement during the pandemic. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone from wherever you are following us. I hope my voice is being heard okay in the mic. Africans Rising is a Pan-African movement of people, organizations across the African continent, but also in the African diaspora. It's really a movement, a solidarity movement. We consider that we are at a new crossroad about African liberation, and that it takes solidarity among Africans on the continent, in the diaspora, to really stand together. So that is really our work, our vision. And we do that in different ways, of course. Solidarity mission, going to places where it's critical, pulling together different organizations and movement that are working in different issues, whether it's around women's issues or environmental issues, but being able to come together to see how everything fits together, and especially our big part of our work is around democracy and getting people's voice heard in the different places where Africans are. So if the question is how have we managed with what we were doing during the pandemic, number one, it made us shift some of our ways, I guess, of organizing, because when we want to build solidarity, we base a lot of our work on convening people. They have to come together, listen, learn from each other's struggle. But it was difficult to be able to do that when the pandemic hit. All of a sudden, we realized that some of the things that we used to do, even from the launch of Africans Rising on Gorée Island in Senegal, having certain big event when we organized our 25th of May Africa Liberation Day gathering, concert, and all of those things came into questions. But also even the focus of what we work on had also to start moving, because people were all figuring out how to survive, if I can call it, on the pandemic. And we had to look at issues of the people's vaccine, what is accessible, how is our health systems not working or working, and what can we do to make sure that our governments are accountable. So the changes really came into the ways of working. So of course a lot of things went online, like what we are doing right now with the Zoom. A lot of work became hybrid, where we will have certain activities in smaller groups instead of larger groups, but then those small groups being connected then through networks and so on. And sometimes we had to completely just change some of the activities. One thing we used to always do, especially in Senegal, was a celebration of invisible giants. These are women who are doing great work, because we always thought that it was important to put visibility on the work of women. And this used to be a great party that brought people from very different ways of life and to celebrate and witness, speak about the work of these women. And we started making videos about them. So now, we have those videos online as people went to interview them and took those images. So yes, the pandemic had pushed us to change some of our ways of doing things, but also had put us to put some attention to certain issues that we were not paying as much attention, I would say, before, especially around issues of health, around issues of violence, on women, because it heightened during the pandemic, the violence on young people and people who are just surviving day to day and doing their work and couldn't really cope with the new rules and laws that came up, especially during the first wave of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Coumba. I'd like to ask you also from my own experience, having lived through the beginning of the pandemic, still in Southeast Asia, heading an office with a large partner network. My question to you would be, if you compared the years between 2020 and now, and you see your work as a movement coordinator, did you see that, did the, let's say, invigorating effects of you being able to support communities outweigh the restrictions that you have experienced, or did you see this period as a period of stress also for your colleagues and inactivity, or did it have this element of you also thinking about other project forms and being able also to implement them during this period?
Yes, I would say in the beginning of the pandemic, especially, it was extremely stressful because we didn't really know what was ahead of us, what's going to happen. Nothing was really clear. Information, changed by the day. And to be able to speak to people, of course, we relied on what we were told, generally either by the government or by the scientific community, and of course the highest priority was to make sure that people are safe before we are able to do anything. And of course, that meant now, how do you make sure you don't put, anybody's, do no harm. You don't want to put anybody's life in danger. But the issues that we were working on did not stop. People really had things that they had to deal with, that they had to fight for.
I think we have lost Coumba at the moment. Can you still hear us, Coumba?
I can hear you.
Okay, you were interrupted for a second. Please continue.
Yeah, there might be just some interruption because of the connection. But I was saying that we had to reconciliate the fact that life continued and struggle had to continue, even though we also had to be in an uncertain moment. So I would say that was a big moment of stress. And also, even in the midst of the pandemic, even knowing that, yes, there are rules and people needed to follow certain rules for health purpose, we also had the knowledge and the understanding that for some people, it was not an option or a choice to just stay home. Because staying home is not, economically possible or viable for them. And for us to be able to also recognize that and support people who needed that and push, decision makers to look at the effect of these rules that was there. But as the time moved with the pandemic and we start learning more and understanding how things went, of course, we quickly adapt and figure out, okay, what in the plan that we have can we still do? What do we need to drop? And what new things can we bring? And how will we do those things? How will we reach out to people to make this happen? And that's where a lot of the technology came in to be able to connect through voice, through video, through written, across our network. I guess one thing that made it easier for us is because anyway we have troubles and struggles around mobility as Africans because of our economic situation, pandemic or not. If you are African, you can just get up and say, I'm going to go this place, and then there is 10,000 reasons where you can't move, whether it's the prices of tickets across this continent and to the diaspora, or it's immigration rules and visas and so on. So we were pretty much very well prepared in that sense, because we had to figure out ways of working even before the pandemic. Many things that maybe in other countries in Europe and so on, people saw it as a drastic blockage on their way of life, used to be our everyday life. So in that sense, it was easier to adapt.
Thank you very much, Coumba. We will talk later also in more details about the
Sí,
activities.
después ampliaremos estos temas y
we will come back to that later. I'd like to bring in Vicente. Vicente will share a very specific aspect with us of his work, because he's a negotiator and advisor to developing countries who operate in multilateral fora. And I wanted to know from you, Vicente, with this kind of specific task and with the UN FCCCC negotiations happening, there was the Biodiversity Convention happening in Kunming, also with the negotiations at the WTO level. How did the pandemic affect, the impact that developing countries could have in civil society, could have in staying engaged and having a voice in these international fora under the conditions of the pandemic? Be very interested to hear from you and your experience.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Manfred, and hello to Richard and Coumba. First, my apologies. I am taking this call in the car because I was not able to swap school taxi driver duties with my wife. She's also in another conference call for her own work. So I thought, well, okay, I'll just take it with here and hopefully it should be okay.
Works perfectly well.
Yeah, thank you. But yes, thank you. As you rightly said, my engagement in the climate negotiations has been as primarily as a negotiator for developing countries. I have represented my home country, the Philippines, as well as having been on the delegation of several other countries, including Guinea in Africa, including Palestine, Bolivia, El Salvador, and Ecuador. And so, but in most of that time, my primary role there has been to try to coordinate developing country negotiators in the climate negotiations. And I think, and I have been at this since 2007, and I think there was when the pandemic started in 2020, all of the negotiating meetings that had been planned were suddenly canceled, and I think that left many of us wondering, how are we going to continue doing the work that we were supposed to do to try to have results in the climate negotiations. I think a big part of that was because we had been so used as negotiators over the past couple of decades or 2.5 decades in terms of negotiating face-to-face, trying to negotiate directly with our counterparts across the table, with the Europeans, with the Americans, with the Japanese. And so for us, it was a bit of a stretch to think, okay, can we continue negotiating online? Can we, in fact, speak with each other as colleagues and as negotiating partners, and see if we can arrive at an outcome? And I think the answer to that, in terms of whether or not one can use online negotiations as a substitute for face-to-face, direct face-to-face negotiations, has been, I think, a clear no, at least from my perspective. And that is because when we tried to do online conversations over the course of 2020, and the first half of 2021, and we had um, the COP presidency, the United Kingdom, trying to get some outcomes in the course of 2020 so that that year would not be wasted. It was very difficult, largely because when you have a setting where you know that some of your colleagues as developing countries are not there, or some of your colleagues suddenly disappear from the screen because their internet got cut off or they couldn't hear, you know, it creates a an impression that the conversation and the discourse and any agreements that might have been achieved were not done in a way that was credible enough, acceptable enough, and therefore legitimate enough. And I think what the big difference was when the regime, when the UNFCCC then tried to do this in-person, face-to-face conference in Glasgow last year, then we saw a big difference. We saw this massive shift because many of us who had been engaged in that process for quite a long time went to Glasgow, saw many of our old colleagues and friends again and partners, and we were able to get back into the discussion and then negotiate directly with our partners. One thing, though, that I think should be highlighted is that the push that the pandemic gave us to try to prepare better as developing country negotiators through online meetings and online conferences was also good in a way, because before we were simply waiting for the time that we would go to Bonn or go to wherever the COP was going to be hosted and then have our preparatory meetings then, which meant that our preparations were necessarily collapsed into a very short period of time, very intense, before we had to negotiate. And over the course of 2020 and 2021, the pandemic, the fact that we are not able to travel, meant that we had to, precisely as what Coumba was saying, meant that we maybe had to shift to using Zoom or Teams or some of these other video conferencing facilities to try to get that conversation continuing. And so I think that was useful, but it's not useful in terms of having to do, say, face-to-face on opposite sides negotiations. Online conversations and online meetings, I think, are useful if you are in a context where all parties around the table have a shared interest or some common understanding that you can jump off from, so that you can actually talk and not be adversarial. At the same time, online meetings also had its downsides, at least from my perspective, because as the coordinator of a big group of 133 developing countries, represented by almost 200 negotiators, that meant that we had to set online meetings at a time where more or less almost everybody could actually join. And if you look at the spread of countries in the group of 77 in China, that includes countries over in the Pacific, all the way west to the western coast of South America. And that is a spread of almost 20 time zones, which meant that at some point, somebody will either have to wake up at dawn or stay up past midnight. And so we had to figure out a way to make sure that we were able to manage that kind of arrangement. So I think on balance, if you were talking about, okay, can this continue? Can we use online meetings as a substitute for face-to-face negotiations when we're talking about important multilateral policy issues? My answer would be no. We need to have face-to-face meetings, because that's the only way that you can actually interact directly with your counterparts. But at the same time, we can use online meetings to prepare better for those. And that helps improve participation, I think. And that also helps engagement with civil society. Because at some points in time, We were able to have online meetings with civil society counterparts, get their feedback, and then when we got to Glasgow, we already knew their faces, so you could actually put the physical person to the name of the person that you were talking to on the screen, and then you were then able to have a better conversation face to face in Glasgow. So it has both pros and cons. It's pro in terms of being able to prepare better, but it's a con if you're talking about having that kind of push and pull kind of conversation when you're negotiating. Thank you.
Quick question I'd like to ask you in that context. Do you think that over the past 2 years, if you look at UNFCCC, but also in particular at the TRIPS negotiations at WTO level, did the pandemic in the context you described weaken the position of developing countries and civil society? Would there have been better outcomes, let's put it that generically, if there wasn't this kind of online not in-person meeting mode you had to endure for the past 2 years?
Would there have been better outcomes had the pandemic not happened? That's a tough question to answer because I think, for example, on the issue of the TRIPS waiver in the WTO, that issue would not have arisen without the pandemic.
You know what I mean, Vincent, is more like, the technical aspects that that the G77 plus China, you as a lead negotiator were drawn into this process of going online all the time, not having the possibility of person-to-person meeting. Did that affect, the outcome especially for the developing countries and the NGOs whom you represent?
I think we were in a happy situation where many of us who were engaged in that process already knew each other. So there was this kind of shared foundation of interpersonal connections that we all had, including with the civil society organizations that we're dealing with. So to that extent, I think we were able to keep that connection going, and there was little loss in terms of the ability to push the thinking and the positions that we wanted to have through the online meetings. And that, I think, was useful because when we got to Glasgow, it was almost as if no time was lost for us. So that's positive in a way. But I would imagine that had we had the opportunity to continue in-person meetings in 2020 and in 2021, it would have been different because, for example, the UK would have had only 1 year of running the show in 2020, and last year would have been the Egyptian, and then this year would have been the UAE in terms of preparing. So, and it's those kinds of factors as well that helps change the dynamic of the negotiations. But because of the pandemic, we've had the UK for 2 years as the COP presidency, which meant that they had much more time to actually lay the groundwork for what they also wanted to see out of the COP. And for us, that meant in some ways a steeper mountain to climb as developing country negotiators. But also in some ways, not as difficult because we were also able to prepare better for many of the things that we wanted to push forward.
Thank you very much, Vicente, for this nuanced insight in your very delicate and very special work. We will come back also later to you to ask you, what you would recommend in a post-pandemic situation to use this transformatory process that would help in the negotiations. Because as I understood what you were saying, these technological solutions to sort of replace in-person meetings with the technical possibilities that also arose with the pandemic is not for you a good way to go, so to speak. And I'd be interested in what kind of suggestions you had for this kind of post-COVID environment and how we could support that at international institutions as well. Okay, thanks. That will bring me to Richard. Richard, you have been doing with your colleagues this really outstanding study on civil society and the global pandemic, Building Back Different. And the first sentence I saw is exactly what is in there for our discussion today. When we talk about positive transformation, not everything was bad. It's not only about shrinking spaces, but spaces opened also for civil society during the pandemic, the exact topic we are talking about. You are basically saying, if I read the first sentence of the study, since the coronavirus pandemic began, civic activists around the world have shifted into a higher gear. And I want to use this sentence for you to elaborate a little bit what is meant by that. And maybe we can already draw on the positive aspects of that higher gear and where you also see the downsides of this higher gear, so to speak.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Manfred, and your colleagues in the BOL for their invitation. So yeah, in Carnegie, we were tracking the pandemic's impact on civil society in a number of different countries and regions around the world through a network of partners we have out in these countries. And the conclusion was quite interesting, largely in the lines that you've just summarized, that in some ways the pandemic has been extremely bad news for civil society, but in some respects it's also acted as a kind of catalyst as well. I wouldn't accentuate the positive. I think overall, the pandemic has been an extremely problematic period for global civil society. We all know that a huge number of governments around the world have rather disingenuously taken advantage of the pandemic to clamp down on civil society organizations, introduce new laws, new restrictions under the guise of emergency health measures. Some of those measures may have been perfectly justified and even necessary, but in most cases, governments, even in the advanced democracies or so-called advanced democracies, have basically introduced under the cover of those emergency measures restrictions on civil society for more political reasons, for more political purposes. And it's quite sobering to see 2 years into the pandemic, a lot of those initial restrictions still exist. And in many cases, they're still becoming more severe and more draconian. So it's been a really bad period in that sense for civil society. Of course, then there's the issue of the economic impact as well. One thing we found was that a lot of civil society organizations around the world who've been quite dependent on external funding have been really hard hit because many international organizations had to cut back their funding quite drastically or move their funds from long-term civil society partners into COVID-related emergency funding. So that again represented quite a difficult challenge for CSOs in many regions. So in that sense, there's a lot to be worried about, and I think these problems are likely to carry on afflicting global civil society for quite some time to come. But then there is this other side that you mentioned in your introductory question, Manfred, and basically colors the flavor of the work that we've done to the extent that one of the conclusions that our partners around the world told us was it's also been a period in which the demand for locally rooted civil society activity has actually grown enormously. It's a period when many CSOs have reacted. They've mobilized to show themselves useful in very practical ways to the pandemic. And in this sense, we've seen an intensification of civic activism around the world. In some cases, these are new organizations forming to address specifically the health emergency. I think the headline conclusion here, or headline trend, is that we've seen the emergence of a lot of quite informally structured organizations and movements. So a lot of these the newer elements of civil society that have emerged specifically in relation to the pandemic look a little bit different from the traditional NGOs. They're a bit more community-based, slightly less hierarchical, a bit flatter in their organizational structures. So that's definitely been a growth area in civil society over the last couple of years. And then also some of the more traditional CSOs, I think this probably gets to the point Coumba was mentioning, have themselves taken on new functions. So they have, our researchers found, adapted quite well. They moved away from their, or complemented their long-standing existing thematic priorities and repurposed to take on board the need to organize health provisions, social provisions within local communities, help deliver food, emergency supplies, and so on and so forth. So that's also a really interesting development, it seems to us, because it means that organizations that have perhaps been dealing with the environment and just the environment for 20 or 30 years have now moved into these other areas to do with the social, economic impacts of the pandemic. And that's beginning to have quite a far-reaching impact on the whole makeup of civil society in different countries around the world. In some countries, we found that these new COVID-related functions of civil society have actually been carried out in quite positive partnership with governments. So governments have been quite hostile to maybe human rights organizations, have actually been willing to work in positive partnership with civil society on the pandemic. So where there was quite hostility between government, states and civil societies before, they seem to have come together in some respects to work on the pandemic, where governments have shown a willingness to respond in an inclusive way to the pandemic. So countries perhaps like Korea or Romania would be two examples where we found the relationship between states and civil societies improving as a result of the pandemic. But then in other countries, exactly the opposite has happened. Maybe countries like Brazil or India, some European countries as well, where governments didn't respond in a particularly skillful way. And civil society has had to come in to kind of fill the gaps, and in a way that's been quite confrontational with government. So in that sense, the impact on civil society has differed across different countries, depending on how governments themselves have responded to the pandemic. So there are basic findings, just to give you a very, very quick overview, Manfred. And I mean, there's two nuances I'd also add just to finish off. One, a lot of the growth in civil society is also not particularly liberal or progressive or rights focused. We have to admit that. It's perhaps not a comfortable conclusion, but we've seen a mobilization of a lot of kind of anti-vaxxer mobilization, protests, groups that have not really accepted government's attempts to deal with the health emergency. There's all that element to civil society as well that is intensified over the last couple of years. And then I think a very important point, I would back up Coumba's point, that while COVID has had this major impact on civil society, I think we have to remember that not everything is about the pandemic, that all these pre-existing political struggles are still going on. I mean, as you know, in Thailand, a lot of it is to do with the local politics of the regime, just as one example. So there's still that political element, quite separate from all the responses we've seen to the health emergency. So it's not everything is about the pandemic.
Thanks, Richard. You know, your report struck a chord with me because, as I said, in March 2020, I was in Thailand, and we've had many partners in the ASEAN region. And for us, almost immediately from the onslaught of the shutdowns and so forth, pandemic related, many of our partners that work with communities shifted that gear very quickly and turned into service providers and asked us also to help them provide humanitarian aid and leave the political work behind, because it was impossible. You know, the ADB was closed. There was no possibility with communities, for example, to lobby for specific topics with the ADB. So this is exactly a reflection of what you said. What I found, what was very difficult for us as an international organization, you know, was to follow the trend, let alone to analyze it. So to shift from political outreach, advocacy to humanitarian which was required. Some of our partners didn't have a choice. The communities they worked with, they were saying, if you're not helping us now, we are down to 2 meals a day. We have no hygiene articles. You know, we are locked down by a government that doesn't care. If you don't support us now, you shall never come back again and talk to us. So there was no choice, you know, for these civil society organizations. And for us, it was very difficult to shift gear because our partners did, you know, but as international organizations with a lot of bureaucratic burden and red tape, you know, to shift money was very difficult. And on top of it, since then, there has been very little time, you know, to think about the aftermath, what needs to be done afterwards while you're in the eye of the storm. And my question to you would be in this context, when is the right time, or has there already been time, you know, to think properly about a post-COVID situation and how international organizations can support it while we're still standing in the thick of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the subject of a shorter report we did at the end of, right at the end of last year. The evidence on that is a bit mixed, to be quite honest. I mean, some CSOs are talking about the need to look longer term to get beyond the pandemic. It's the situation you describe, Manfred, I think is a tricky balance, because in many ways civil society groups had to respond to the immediate health emergency and the humanitarian situation. And of course, and that's good. I mean, that was necessary. In a way, it increased civil society's local legitimacy, because it represented a situation where civic groups were looking inwards and responding to the demands of their own local communities rather than the international community. I mean, as you know, that issue has been on the agenda for many, many years, and has been a kind of perennial debate amongst the civil society community. So that in that way, the pandemic kind of pushed CSOs in the direction that they'd already been recognizing for many years. They needed to move in addressing local concerns rather than addressing their accountability to international funders. But of course, there's a risk if over the longer term, all the political and rights work gets left aside. In some cases, it has been a little bit left aside because of the health emergency, but because the restrictions are still there being imposed by regimes, in a way, it's forced many civil society organizations at the risk of being closed down and targeted by regimes to keep the political rights issue at the top of their work as well. So I think going forward, we're likely to see this balance with new kinds of movements trying to defend their own political rights in a very immediate sense, while also showing themselves relevant to these local service provision priorities as well. What we found is that in some cases, civil society organizations are seeking quite skillfully to use the pandemic as a way of pushing their arguments that they've been advocating for many years, for fundamental change in economic models, for fundamental changes in the way we understand local democratic engagement and democratic participation, and so on and so forth. So I think now those issues are on the agenda, and I think they will gradually come to the surface. But I think over the last year, because the pandemic has carried on getting worse for longer maybe than many people expected, I think those longer term political and economic changes are still taking time to come through.
Thanks, Richard. That brings me back to you, Coumba, because I was already mentioning the Africans Rising COVID-19 Solidarity Fund. And I wanted to taking up Richard's comments, you know, from your experience working with this Pan-African movement, how did you deal with this kind of relationship between being almost forced to provide this humanitarian health-related work versus your political work, you know, to be out there to lobby for freedoms, for gender democracy and so forth? How did you deal with this kind of dilemma?
I would say that thank you so much, Richard and Vicente. Great to hear your perspective. I would say that from Africans Rising perspective, we stayed focused on the work for rights, for freedom, because we understand that many of the humanitarian crises that we have to deal with every day are connected to the macro changes that are not happening. In the middle of the pandemic, one of our first or biggest, I would say, webinar was titled Feminist Post-Covid Economic Recovery. We were in the midst of the pandemic, yes, and we knew that there were things that needed to be done. And yes, we had launched the COVID fund, where we just ask our members, whoever can support, to go into the communities, give support to who they can while the pandemic was going on. But we knew that what was paramount and most important was to look at the systems in which that we lived in, because for us the pandemic was an underliner of what was already going on. Yes, it is a health issue, but it showed how, for example, governments were not listening to their people. It showed the violence that the police could exert on young people even before the pandemic. It brought out, to light that the violence, on the domestic violence on children and women that pre-existed, but that now we're getting even more shown. So for us, really, the pandemic was that underliner of issues that were already going on, the injustices in the international relationship, in the development area, the hoarding of the mask and the vaccine issues. All of that just showed what type of world we lived in, and the struggles that we were already, the battles that we were already in, just got even clearer. And in some ways, it helps, like what Richard was saying, to explain to people why was it so important to understand what are the negotiations that are happening, that our governments are doing in our names, and how the resources of our countries were used. Because when you spoke about it maybe before, some people might think that it's not priority, or it's not something that they want to be involved in. But the pandemic showed that in the end, when we talk about international development and relationships, then countries start, looking first for themselves, if we can call it so, even in a situation where we're dealing with a virus, for God's sake, something that could get anywhere, but still it was extremely difficult for the international community. It showed that it didn't really exist, that people were not ready to fight, to face even a virus that was dangerous for them at a level where they could deal with it in a global sense. It showed us the place or the spot where we are as African in this world. So it was also, I want to say, an eye-opener about the possibilities also that we have within our own communities. What could people do? The ways in which also it existed, and people always have figured out ways of being in solidarity and supporting each other and so on. But now that there was no other option, it even showed even better how that was possible, and how that was what we remained with. So I would say that it also gave us time, a little bit of time, because yes, like Vicente was saying, some meetings got canceled, and all the big guys who used to fly and meet couldn't do it right away. and it gave us a little minute to breathe and to rethink. For example, we are preparing, the alternative water forum in Dakar, but because it got delayed because of the pandemic, I think that it gave us a little more time for us to organize it, to get some resources to understand better what is going on at that level of those negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Coumba. I'd like, because we are now nearing the 1 hour mark, I'd like to come to the last broader question. What could we learn as an international community, as a political foundation, to properly support the work you are doing, especially Coumba, but also Vicente, to be operative as democratic actors in the future, to play your role within the communities, within the geographical area or specific professional area you are operating in. And I would like to ask you, Vicente, from your experience of the past 2 years, what would you expect, political foundations, if you look at the impact that developing countries can have, or civil societies from developing countries in the international fora can have, what should be done, to keep them at a place that they can negotiate at an eye level and really have an impact on these negotiations?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's an excellent question, Manfred. And I think just jumping off from both what Richard and Coumba were saying, there are a couple of things that I think would be important, for example, for foundations like HPF and other support organizations can provide. One is, the lesson is that we need in-person meetings first, and that needs to be supported because that provides us, civil society organizations, those of us working in the progressive movements, that shared experience in a way, that personal knowledge of each other, that is the basis for generating trust. And that is very important. And then once you have that sense of, yes, we know that person who is talking and we have been able to break bread together, have some drinks over a restaurant because we were together in a strange city, then we can have online meetings to follow up the conversation, to deepen the engagement, to strengthen the discourse, and carry the conversation forward. And then have another, and then before meetings where we have to go to in order to push certain policy positions, for example, then it's also important to have a validation in-person, face-to-face meeting again, in order to be able to agree on the conditions. And I think this is something that we did learn from the pandemic. We cannot rely on technology alone to carry us through in terms of creating that shared sense of understanding about where we want to go. And I think this is and this really came out very clearly, at least for me, in Glasgow. We had the advantage going into Glasgow in terms of having had worked with many colleagues in the past, and so we knew each other. But I think for many of those who were, and I have heard this from young negotiators who were coming into the process for the first time, who had come in 2020 and therefore had not had the chance to interact with many of us who were in the process before them. They were completely lost when you went to Glasgow, despite all of the online meetings that they had attended and all of the briefings we had prepared. And it was only when you were able to actually do that in face-to-face actual experience of going through that sort of things start to gel in terms of the conceptual architecture, and then in terms of how we fit certain ideas and certain concepts into this overall policy regime that we were trying to develop. And so I think we have to think of a way of matching the strengths of those two kinds of conversation modalities, and in-person, face-to-face arrangements are important to create shared community sense. And then online meetings would be important in order to carry it forward so that you are able to strengthen either your organization, your networks. And I think many civil society organizations, international, are even doing this now. I'm part of multiple networks where there has been a rapid uptick in terms of the number of online planning meetings we are now doing, which we did not have before because we were waiting for us to see each other again physically. But now we are, but many of the networks I'm in now are saying, okay, let's do our planning meeting online, circulate papers online, and then let's meet each other when we get to Bonn or when we get to Egypt or whichever international meeting we will be heading off to next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicente, for these kind of really clear demands on what your expectations would be in terms of support, such as the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Coumba, to you, from your experience, taking up the same question, what would you say? What would be your expectations in that regard?
Yeah, I would say the first expectation would be that different organizations, including the political foundations, make sure that our voices and our demands are heard when they can stand in places where we cannot. And I will give clear examples today. It is important that the people, the regular people in Germany, understand what their government stand is, on Africa, for example. What is, I don't know, German military doing in Mali? What German person knows about that? We need to make sure that the foundation and the partners that you are make pass down or pass up the situation and the information of our our struggle, and we talk about deep changes. We're not talking about charity. We're not talking about just exchanges. We're talking about major shift in the way international relationships are going. We're talking about having African agency. We're talking about the use of resources, global resources. What is the share of the global resources that citizens are using? I think the best help that we can get from you is the work that you can do with your own people that we cannot always talk to based on the barriers of language, distance, and so on. Because then if democracy works for real, then they will be the one to speak to their own government, and will make the work easier for us to speak and fight even our own government, because we cannot fight ours and fight yours also in many ways. So that would be my biggest piece. And just for the general international I want to say philanthropy or donors community, however we want to call it, it's to give, to support, and in a way that brings real transformation. I think what COVID-19 we hoped deeply could bring and show. The environmental movement have been speaking about this, the interconnectedness of life, what touch one, touch another one. We are on the same boat, we are on the same globe, but it didn't seem to sink in, many times. But I think, the virus, we hope kind of, open people's eyes, like, what's next? We do breathe the same air, and we do drink, somehow some of these same waters, and certain things that affect us will not be, it's not possible to to keep them in one corner and defend oneself, no matter, the amount of gold or whatever that gets accumulated. So, and we saw that resources exist and are available. Before the COVID-19, it was clearly, told to us that, hey, we are poor, we are a developing country. There's certain resources that we cannot get access to because they just don't exist. We just need, to do what we have, and the life of, women or children, dying for very simple, disease did not, look like a big catastrophe. But when COVID-19 hit, all of a sudden money started flying. Governments and countries who were saying that there is no money start pulling it from somewhere. So we want to say, if something is possible, some shift and some changes are possible when there is a catastrophe or a danger, why should we wait to be at that verge to move and change things when we know our lives are so interconnected? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Coumba, for this really rich input to that question. Richard, from the point of view of a researcher knowing the world of the political foundation, maybe from you a few words about, our responsibility and the opportunities we should use, in a post-COVID environment to support the movements such as Coumba's, Vicente's work. What would be necessary and important during such a phase?
I think following on from Coumba's last point, the international organizations can help states and civil society organizations be better prepared for the next crisis, as we don't have to wait for the next crisis for these kind of resources to be released. I think there's still a lot of basic work to be done to help protect civil society organizations on the ground from regimes' attacks. Many governments are still intent on restricting the space for civil society activity. So they need firmer, stronger help, more effective help from outside just to stay in existence and stay safe. I think the international organization needs to get its funding levels back up, not just for COVID work, but back on the kind of the core human rights, the climate agenda, and so on and so forth, as we hopefully move beyond the pandemic phase. I think international organizations, funders, foundations can help with exactly the question you asked, Manfred, how civic organizations can take advantage of this moment to push agendas for more far-reaching change, economic, social, and political. And then finally, I think very, very importantly, they can help build broader sets of alliances. There's a lot of new civic movements that have formed in the last couple of years, but it's all very scattered. Many of these are very small. They don't have big amounts of resources, or they're not well structured. And the danger is that a lot of this momentum could be lost and simply evaporate very quickly. So I think there's room for organizations to come in and try and build bridges and help sustain this momentum over the longer term by building alliances and coalitions between some of the newer groups and the more established civil society organizations. Because otherwise I have a fear that there's a lot of very interesting and useful and admirable stuff going on in civil society, but it could all get a bit lost if it's not welded together into something capable of having more political impact.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this very important input, I think, which we should take close to our hearts and think about it, and even start thinking about it while we're in the middle of this pandemic. Still, I feel, and still to deal with this outfall, but I think it's a good time, and this is what the conference was for us, with your help to analyze the situation, to take up these voices, And on a personal note, I'd like to say, that for me, in preparation of this event, reading your papers, looking in the work you're doing, seeing what your organizations are doing, it was very enriching experience. And I'd like to thank you very much for having shared your experience and thoughts with us. And with that, I would like to end our panel and hand over to Luisa to see whether there are questions to you that you will see who will answer that. So thanks very much for this panel.
Thank you very much also from my side. And yes, we received some questions, and there is a comment saying that they weren't aware that some governments started partnering with human rights organizations despite hostile relations prior to the pandemic. And then there's a question to Vicente. Do you feel that the global conveners such as the UN are rather happy that there is less physical participation from the global south, or are they proactively working on alternative ways to include civil society?
Mm-hmm. So the first question then goes straight to you, Richard, and the second one obviously to you, Vicente.
Yes, these partnerships have been forming, but as I said in the opening remarks, it really varies from country to country. In other countries, relations between governments and civil society have worsened, and that relates to another one of the comments I see in the chat about civil society stepping in to provide services almost as a substitute for the state that may be helpful in the short run, but of course involves a longer term risk that then states feel somehow exonerated from their responsibilities to provide those core state functions. So again, it's a difficult balance. It may be a necessary step in the short term, but perhaps should not become the main function of all civil society organizations over the longer term. But as I say, on the specific question of these new kinds of partnerships where governments have recognized that civil society partners can play a valuable role in getting out help to local communities. This is positive and beneficial. It's been an upside of the pandemic response, but it is a tactical challenge for these groups because that kind of partnership, it seems to me, shouldn't divert them completely from their more confrontational or questioning or critical agenda towards governments on things like human rights and democracy and their failure to follow through on climate commitments as well. So it's going to be a very, very difficult balancing act going forward, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And just following up on what Richard was saying. Yes, I think when the pandemic started and things started moving online, whether it was in the UN in New York, in the WTO and the UN here in Geneva, or in the UNFCCC negotiations in Bonn. It was, I think, for many of us, both from civil society side and from the developing country negotiator side, we were very wary, I think, and cautious about the shift to try to enhance online conversations and negotiations, and largely because it was when you go online and it's not in an in-person face-to-face setting, the power of the pen becomes magnified. The power of who holds that pen becomes magnified, and what that meant was that in a context where conversations are online, it's often then whoever is facilitating the conversation and whoever is supporting that conversation becomes the power increases in terms of shaping and guiding and determining what the outcome is, which that power imbalance between participants and perceived, the facilitator or the chair of the negotiations becomes exacerbated if you're not seeing each other face to face, and if you cannot pass pieces of paper to each other with your own text to her or him, for her or him to put into new iterations of the text. And I think that is that was one learning, because many of these things, many of the conversations, climate conversations that we were engaged in 2020 and 2021, essentially became exercises in which the chairs or the facilitators of those conversations were trying their best to capture, to in their own output what they thought they heard from those who were speaking on the screen. And I think that is the reason why over and over again, my colleagues and I would stress that when we were engaging in those online meetings, there would be no outcomes, that anything that the chairs or the facilitators put out will be on their own responsibility. It does not bind anybody. And of course, the signal that sends is that the process is not moving forward because you're just spinning your wheels, which is why it was so important that you had to have that in-person meeting in Glasgow in order for governments, for civil society to be able to go in there and see the text being developed and have at least some level of comfort that what they're trying to say and that what they're trying to put into the text that's going to become the agreed text was because they were directly heard by whoever was writing that document. And an in-person meeting is, I think, at this point in time, the best modality for us to do that. So I would say at the end of it all, if we this exercise that was done in 2020 and 2021 of many of these multilateral processes trying to get themselves moving through online negotiations, quote unquote, I think was deficient from a maybe democratic governance standpoint because of the inordinate power it gave to the facilitators or the chairs. And in that light, having in-person meetings would have been more democratic in a way, or at least more participatory, and in a way also more transparent in a way, even though in actual practice there are also many deficiencies that one needs to address. Thank you.
I think I have a question for Coumba now. It is in the past few months, there has been an increased number of coups across Africa. Is this the aftermath of the handling of the pandemic by African leaders, or did the pandemic serve as a catalyst for these occurrences? And what does resurgence of coups mean for democracy on the continent?
Wow, big question, eh?
Long question.
haven't done the research and figuring out what the connection is. But what is clear is that there is a clear dissatisfaction, and even I want to say just people feeling that democratic processes have not delivered or come through, because in the end, what some people will say on the street is that they don't eat democracy. So people need to live to be in security, to be able to move around and not fear for their lives. People need to be able to have access to food, to quality education, to health, and so on. And while there has been big, I would say, advances in terms of some of the processes, electoral processes to elect, locally or nationally, that did not translate directly into a difference in the majority of people's lives when it comes to those things that I just enumerated. And also maybe the COVID-19 and the situation it put us, did again, I want to say, maybe, I don't know if it's an English word, add up to the fragility of governments and people that already do not always have all the means to take care of what they need to take care, and the suppression of also people's voice. I mean, like we say, when they say things are not working for us, they're not listening. Of that cry, I think has something to do with what we are witnessing. But I think it goes far beyond West Africa and Africa. It's also connected to the changes and the global dynamics of power and politics that are manifesting in our small regions, and of course it's more striking, it's more visible here, but it's a tense situation around the world globally.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question. If there's a general observation that civil society organizations shifted from a more political agenda to immediate humanitarian and health and basic services.
Richard, I think that goes back to the point you've already made. Maybe you want to comment on that?
Yes, the answer is yes. It's not happening everywhere. It's not happening with all organizations. As I said, some still have this much more defensive agenda. They need to have this more defensive agenda as they're being attacked politically, just to keep themselves in operation and safe and functioning. But in many cases, examples we found were, say, in Brazil, many environmental groups kind of switched to these more health-related functions, at least for the worst part of the pandemic. That's just one example amongst many we found. It's one trend amongst many. It's not the only trend. There are countervailing trends as well, but I think it's one we need to track. As I say, I think there's positive sides in that, but also more question marks, at least, that need to be asked about what the right balance is over the medium term between responding to these kinds of local needs on the one hand, and on the other hand, to keep addressing the longer term political challenges that many countries are facing.
Maybe, yeah, Coumba, I was just thinking of you, so I just leave it because I can guess what you want to say. Please go ahead.
Thank you. No, what I was going to say is that with what the pandemic showed us and allow us to do is to make that link between those needs. Yes, we saw the pandemic coming and we realized, okay, we don't have the health infrastructure that we need in our countries. So the question is, why don't we have that? Why is it that we have groups of people who, when they are sick, can fly to Europe and get support, and the rest of us are here and cannot get some of this basic support? So of course, people, many organizations shifted and said, listen, we need to make sure people have access to this and that. But the question was there also about how come with the resources that we have, with the politics that we have, with the democracy that we have, and the elections that we've done, how come we don't know where our resources are going? How come what is priority for us? So then, yes, we would work on the same issue. It's just a different way of coming at it and holding our own government accountable, but also holding the international community and the international government accountable, and saying, what is it that make you think that we can produce a vaccine this way and then decide that nobody else can use it, or this one can work. All those questions came up because of the pandemic. So yes, the responses have been multiple.
So
Manfred,
yes,
Manfred, if I may add, just to give some reflections as well in terms of the work that my colleagues and I at Third World Network have been doing. It's true that many of the colleagues that we have at the height of the pandemic shifted focus from the political or policy related work we were doing into trying to address the health related issues that the pandemic has given rise to us. And both Richard and Coumba are absolutely correct. The issue, though, I think, is moving forward. What do we learn from this? And what do we do with the systemic and structural flaws that was revealed by the pandemic? And I think we have to do a better job at crafting that narrative of structural change that we need, because it seems like nothing has changed. When we look at, for example, the recent announcements of governments, for example, in Europe, that we are reopening up. When we look at the responses of some governments in the WTO with respect to the request from developing countries for a TRIPS waiver of patents on vaccines, for example. When we look at the outcomes of COP26 in terms of what kind of accelerated action on climate change that takes into context the fact that the pandemic has caused many developing country economies to contract. That kind of structural thinking, a structural change thinking, does not seem to have come out very strongly. And I think that's something that perhaps foundations like HBF, in partnership with civil society organizations underground like Coumbas, or international NGOs like Third World Network that work at the multilateral policy level, maybe it's a conversation that we all need to engage in, to see how we can, and as well as with the academic community, to see how we can really craft a much stronger and much more impelling narrative that we need systems change, that we cannot go back to business as usual, because the business that as usual that gave rise to climate change, that gave rise to the unequal, highly unequal, highly inequitable responses to the pandemic, should it be the same situation? Should it be the same system that we will see coming out of the pandemic? And I think maybe that's where organizations like HBF can also help trigger that kind of conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicente. Luisa, is there anything else from your side?
Yeah, I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Yes.
What would you say? Okay, so there's one question asking, how do you see the role of initiatives of Catalyst 2030, where philanthropy and social entrepreneurship join forces to support initiatives to reach this sustainable development goals and support system change? Maybe complicated. Maybe
I would just say that that where Vicente left. The point now is for us to look at the flow in the systems that the COVID-19 underline. If we are serious about system change, if we are serious about justice, it's to look at those, because the system that made it possible to patent a vaccine in this way and make it not available to people, and still have those organizations as the reference on world governance. It's quite, you know, mind blowing. So when we talk about systemic change, we need to mean it. And sometimes what it means is really to, I don't want to say release some privileges, but it's also to be ready to not make as much profit out of certain situations. It means to repair damages done and to recognize issues that needs to be recognized, and that's our way really out, or our way, because there is really no way out, but our way forward to building a real global community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Coumba, for these last comments. I guess that was also the last question during this conference panel. So that leaves me again to thank all three of you, and also Luisa for your kind help with arranging everything and getting everything underway. I'd also like to thank the audience and the listeners for their interest. And I hope that this is the beginning of continued engagement with these issues represented by Coumba, Vicente, and also by Richard's research. And with that, I would like to close the event, and hope to see you soon in other environments to discuss issues of this ongoing debate we need to have. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manfred, Coumba, Richard.
Thanks, Louise,
Thank you,
Manfred.
Manfred.
Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.